Jesus appeared to his disciples several times during a period of almost 6 weeks after his resurrection in Jerusalem. His final instructions to them, before he ascended into heaven, can serve as a kind of overview of the entire book of Acts. You will be witnesses for me in Jerusalem, in all of Judea and Samaria, and in every part of the world.
Thousands of Jews believed the gospel preached by the apostles in Jerusalem, and they were baptized. The city had no large body of water nearby, and the baptisms must have taken place in small ritual immersion pools, or perhaps in cisterns where rainwater was collected under the houses.
After a period of perhaps several years in Jerusalem, Simon Peter, who is the leading figure of the first chapters of Acts, went down to the town of Lydda.
From Lydda, Peter was asked by the believers to come to Joppa, or Yaffo, on the coast. Here he raised from the dead a woman named Dorcas. While he was in Joppa, Peter stayed at the home of a man who made his living by making leather from animal skins. In response to a vision and an invitation from a Roman military officer, Peter went north to the city of Caesarea, where he preached the gospel to non-Jews. The first believers in Jesus, like Jesus himself, were Jews. Even before Peter went to Caesarea, the gospel had left the confines of Judaism when a Jerusalem believer named Philip preached in the region of Samaria.
In Caesarea were the headquarters of the Roman army in the province of Judea. Caesarea had been built by Herod the Great in honor of the first Roman emperor, Augustus. The Roman governor normally stayed there, going up to Jerusalem only on special occasions.
Caesarea was a large city, spreading inland from the sea. It boasted a port and all of the normal institutions of a well-developed Hellenistic city. Acts chapter 12 describes the death of Herod Agrippa I in Caesarea. The Jewish historian Josephus gives us a similar description and places the speech of Agrippa in the theater of Caesarea.
While the young church grew rapidly in and around Jerusalem, it did encounter opposition. The most dedicated opponent was a young student of the law of Moses named Saul. After the death of Stephen, in which Saul took part, he received permission from the Jewish authorities in Jerusalem to go to Damascus, an important city in the province of Syria, and there arrest believers in Jesus. Outside the walls of Damascus, Saul had an experience that would change his life dramatically. Seeing a bright flash of light, he fell to the ground. Then he heard a voice calling his name. "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?"
The speaker was Jesus. He commissioned Saul to preach the gospel. The light had made Saul blind, and he had to be led by the hand into the city. He was brought to the house of a man called Judah in the street called Straight. After he was healed and baptized, Saul, whose Greek name was Paul, began to preach in Damascus with the same zeal with which he had persecuted those Jews who had believed in Jesus.
Other Jews there, who had expected Paul to solve their Jesus problem, saw that he was only making it worse. They made plans to kill him. Paul's friends helped him escape one night by lowering him in a basket from the city wall. Paul did not go directly back to Jerusalem. Instead, he traveled to Arabia in the kingdom of Nabatea.
The Nabateans were an Arab people who inhabited the desert regions in the south and east of the land of Canaan. From about the 4th century BC until perhaps the late 1st century AD, their capital was in the city of Petra. Petra was literally carved out of the rock, and indeed Petra means rock, as does the Old Testament name for the same place, Selah. Petra was a city of tombs and temples. It was a necropolis, a city of the dead. Near Petra was the commercial center, called Little Petra, where camel caravans were unloaded and the goods were stored.
The Nabateans made their living primarily from transporting spices and perfumes produced in southern Arabia and the Far East. These included rare luxury goods, such as myrrh and frankincense. From southern Arabia to their main shipping port of Gaza was a distance of over 2,300 kilometers. The transported goods were carried by caravans of camels along the so-called spice route. The trip could take many weeks, and the Nabateans maintained some 65 rest stations along the route. In the Negev region, the most important of these stations was at Avdat. The Nabateans also had a substantial army to guard the camel caravans and the rest stations.
In the 1st century BC, the Nabatean kingdom expanded northward into southern Syria, reaching as far as the city of Damascus. Paul returned from Arabia to Damascus. His activity in Arabia may have angered the Nabatean king Aretas IV, who not long afterward gave orders that Paul should be arrested. From Damascus, Paul returned to Jerusalem. However, his enthusiastic preaching soon aroused opposition in Jerusalem, as it had in Damascus. At the urging of the church leaders, Paul took a ship to the city of Tarsus in Cilicia, where he had been born.
Tarsus was located in what is today southeast Turkey. It was a port city and an important commercial center. Tarsus was a Greco-Roman city, and being born there gave Paul Roman citizenship. The city was known for its excellent educational institutions, and the young Jewish boy received training in Greek philosophy and rhetoric, which is the art of arguing, debating, and writing.
At a young age, Paul moved to Jerusalem, where he received a more traditional Jewish education, studying the law of Moses and the traditions of his people. He studied under the famous rabbi and Pharisee Gamaliel, an influential member of the Jewish council, the Sanhedrin. Paul himself became a devoted member of the party of the Pharisees.
Once the gospel started to spread outside the land of Israel, it made quick progress, first to the island of Cyprus, then to the city of Antioch, not far from Paul's hometown. Here the gospel was preached to people who were not Jewish. Barnabas, who was a native of Cyprus, went to Tarsus to look for Paul to help in the new challenge of taking the gospel to the Gentiles.
The book of Acts records 4 journeys taken by Paul. On the first journey, he teamed up with Barnabas, the man who had supported him in Jerusalem and Antioch. Paul's home base was the city of Antioch, and he always returned to report to the church there. Antioch was the capital city of the province of Syria, which included Judea and Galilee. It was one of the 3 most important cities in the empire, after Rome and Alexandria. A cave near the modern city of Antakya may have been one of the earliest meeting places of the believers, who were first given the name Christians at Antioch.
From Seleucia, the port of Antioch, Paul and Barnabas sailed to the island of Cyprus. After they had preached for a time in Jewish synagogues, the governor of the island, Sergius Paulus, asked to hear their message, and he himself became a believer. The governor was originally from another city called Antioch, in the district of Pisidia.
The apostles sailed from Cyprus, landed at the port city of Perga, and went directly to this second Antioch, where the family of Sergius Paulus had a large estate. It is possible that he supplied the 2 apostles with letters of introduction to influential people in his hometown. At the time Paul visited Pisidian Antioch, about 47 AD, the city had magnificent buildings and was a center for the cult of the deified emperors. The theater and the main street, with shops on each side, have been excavated.
All over Asia Minor, present-day Turkey, there were cities founded centuries earlier by Greeks, who had left the rather barren Greek peninsulas and islands to find living space and fertile land. These Greek colonists brought with them Greek culture and language. So everywhere Paul traveled in Asia Minor, he could speak the Greek language and be understood. Paul's journey from Perga to Antioch in Pisidia was on good paved roads that connected all the major cities in Asia Minor. Paul would have used a pass through the Taurus Mountains, which run parallel to the coast and reach an altitude of more than 2,000 meters. Most of the year, the Taurus peaks are covered with snow.
Land travel was relatively easy in the Roman Empire. Along the main thoroughfares there were inns where people could rest and eat and where fresh horses and mules could be obtained. Paul may normally have traveled on horseback and was able to cover long distances in relatively short periods of time. He could have crossed the entire length of Asia Minor, a distance of over 1,000 kilometers, in about 2 weeks.
From Antioch in Pisidia, they went to preach the gospel in the cities of Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe, all in the southern Galatia region. They visited most of those cities twice, as they returned along the same route back to their home base at Antioch in Syria. On the way to Italia, where they took the boat back to Antioch, Paul preached in the synagogue of Perga.
The highly successful evangelizing trip raised some serious questions for the young church. Until that time, all of the believers in Jesus were Jews, and very little attempt had been made to extend the gospel to non-Jews. As word filtered back to the church leaders in Jerusalem that large numbers of Gentiles were being admitted into the fellowship of believers, the church was faced with a serious question. Was this just a Jewish movement? Should non-Jews be converted to Judaism before they were allowed into fellowship? Paul and Barnabas were invited to Jerusalem to explain what they had been doing. The discussion that followed came to be known as the Jerusalem Council. Its decision was clear. The gospel was for everyone. Gentiles were welcome, and they did not first need to convert to Judaism. The two apostles carried the news back to Antioch, where it was received joyfully. They decided to return to the cities where they had first preached, but they could not agree on whom to take with them. After just one trip together, their partnership broke up. Barnabas set out for Cyprus with his cousin Mark, while Paul chose a new partner, Silas. Paul and Silas traveled overland through Asia Minor and arrived here at Troas, a port city on the coast of the Aegean Sea. Here in Troas, Paul had a vision. A man from Macedonia calling him, begging him to come and bring the gospel. And so, Paul and Silas sailed out of Troas, went across the sea to Macedonia, carrying the gospel to Europe. This was a significant turning point in the spread of the gospel in the early church.
This was probably in the year 49 AD.
Macedonia, the homeland of Alexander the Great, was an important and prosperous Roman province. The Romans had conquered the kingdom of Macedonia in the 2nd century BC. The most important city in Macedonia was Philippi, which stood along the Via Egnatia, the main road linking Rome with the east. The Romans also established a large colony around the city, giving land to retired Roman officers. These, together with Greeks and local Thracians, formed the population of the large city. The Roman aristocrats owned estates outside the city, where large numbers of slaves worked the fields.
Philippi had many temples devoted to different gods, a theater, and all the other buildings normally found in a Greco-Roman city. In Philippi, the apostles met Lydia, a Greek woman from the city of Thyatira in Asia Minor who had converted to Judaism. She traded in purple cloth, most probably selling the purple dye made from a sea snail, a famous export commodity of the Phoenicians. The wearing of purple cloth was restricted only to aristocrats. The presence of this Greek woman indicates that there was a market for purple cloth in Philippi. Lydia accepted Paul's preaching of the gospel and was baptized in the river outside Philippi, which probably had no synagogue.
In Philippi, Paul and Silas were arrested and thrown into prison. An ancient prison was often just a place to hold someone until a punishment could be determined and carried out. Prisons could be buildings specially prepared for this purpose, but they were often little more than a hole in the ground. Jeremiah was held in a dry cistern, and it is possible that Jesus was held in something similar before he was led out to be crucified. While the exact structure of the prison in Philippi is unknown, the text does say that it had doors. The prison in Philippi may have looked like this cave, with a wall closing it in from the front. Paul and Silas were put into wooden stocks, which would have been very uncomfortable.
From Philippi, Paul and Silas went to Thessalonica, the capital city of the province of Macedonia. In Thessalonica, Paul's preaching led to a clash with certain Jews. They caused an uproar in the city, and Paul had to leave in a hurry. He left behind him a young church that became quite strong. From Thessalonica they went to Berea, and from there Paul traveled on alone to Athens, most probably by sea. As he approached Athens, Paul would have seen the impressive temple of Poseidon, the god of the sea, which dominated a cape near the city.
Paul arrived in Athens before his companions, who may have traveled overland. Athens had once been the most important city in Greece, but by Paul's time it was small and relatively insignificant, and known only for various philosophical schools that were active there. As was his custom, Paul spoke about Jesus in the local synagogue.
Paul also came here into the Agora.
The marketplace.
That's right, and here he discussed with Epicurean and Stoic philosophers.
Well, you know, they actually thought he was going to introduce new gods into the city. Jesus and Anastasis.
Ah, the resurrection.
Yes.
And then they brought him to a hill called the Areopagus.
Yes, that was the place where the city council of Athens met.
That's right. This council was responsible not only for the state affairs, but also for the religious matters of the city.
Right, it was actually their duty to investigate people like Paul teaching about new gods.
So the name Areopagus actually can refer not only to the hill, but also to the place where the council met.
Would Paul have seen from this hill of Areopagus?
The Areopagus stands right next to the hill of the Acropolis, and on the Acropolis Paul would have seen magnificent white marble temples shining in the sun, including, for example, the temple called the Parthenon, dedicated to the patron goddess of the city, Athena.
And where would the altar to the unknown god be located?
Very good question. No one's ever found an altar to an unknown god yet here in the city, and so we don't know where that altar might have been.
Paul's conversations with the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers would have taken place in a covered area called a stoa. The stoa was constructed of rows of columns covered with a high roof. Protected from the heat of the sun, people could carry on business in the shops or even have philosophical discussions. Many ancient cities had a fortified high place, known in Greek as Acropolis or upper city. In addition to being elevated and easier to defend, the Acropolis of a city often held temples and other sacred structures of the city. The prominent temple on the Acropolis of Athens was dedicated to the goddess Athena and was called the Parthenon.
The way Paul related to the religion of the Athenians was really quite remarkable.
It's true. Luke describes him as being extremely upset by all the idols he saw around the city. But when Paul starts to talk to the people in the marketplace, he actually shows great respect for their religious beliefs.
Yes, we might have expected him to attack idol worship, as he does in some of his letters.
As a matter of fact, he actually quotes from their poets, including one poem dedicated to the god Zeus.
How do you explain his gentle approach here in Athens?
Well, I see it as an application of Paul's own principle, which he states in 1 Corinthians, that he has become all things to all men so that he may save some of them.
Yes, but I think we should also consider the different audiences. Luke shows Paul speaking respectfully of Greek religion and philosophy, but when Paul himself writes to Christians, his perspective on the same beliefs is far less positive.
From Athens, Paul traveled on to Corinth. He lived and preached in Corinth for a year and a half, and later wrote at least 2 letters back to the church there. The city of Corinth was the capital of the Roman province of Achaia. It was much larger than Athens, with a population of several hundred thousand. Corinth was located on a narrow strip of land separating 2 important bodies of water in Greece. This location gave the city great strategic and commercial advantages.
While Paul stayed in Corinth, he preached the gospel every Sabbath day in the local synagogue. While no remains of that synagogue have been found, archaeologists did find an inscription from a later synagogue that most likely stood on the same location. The full inscription probably read, Synagogue of the Hebrews.
Another inscription indicates that a large paved area near the theater was paid for by a man named Erastus. The name Erastus was not a common one, and it is quite possible that this is the same man who greeted the church in Rome when Paul wrote to them from Corinth. It is probably the same Erastus who is mentioned in Acts 19 and in 2 Timothy 4. Like Athens and many other Greek cities, Corinth lay at the foot of an acropolis, or sacred upper part of the city. It was called the Acrocorinth. On its slopes and on its peak were located temples to various gods.
The Jewish community in Corinth accused Paul before the Roman proconsul, a man by the name of Gallio.
What exactly was their accusation?
Well, Luke just quotes them briefly as saying, this man persuades men to worship God in a way that's contrary to the law.
Which law were they talking about?
That's a good question. They were probably speaking Greek, so we can assume they used the word nomos.
But that could mean either Roman civil law or Jewish law, the Torah.
Exactly, and Gallio himself, in fact, may have been unsure as to which one they meant at first, and so he probably told them they need to be more specific.
But his answer makes it clear that he did not see it as a matter for a Roman court. He replies that it is only a quarrel about their own law.
To hear their case, Gallio sat on a special platform called a bema, which was for hearing legal cases or for delivering public speeches. Just such a platform was found in front of the residence of the proconsul. From the dates inscribed on it, it may well have been the one where Gallio sat. Paul ended his second journey with brief stops in Ephesus and probably in Jerusalem before returning to Antioch in Syria.
Almost 3 years of Paul's next journey with the gospel were spent in Ephesus. Except for the brief stop there at the end of the previous journey, he had avoided the city. From Antioch, Paul took the shortest overland route directly to Ephesus. Ephesus was the capital city of the province of Asia and one of the largest and most important cities of the Roman Empire. It boasted a population of over 250,000 and was the center of the highly popular cult of the goddess Artemis. Artemis was a goddess of fertility, a mother goddess figure portrayed in ancient art as having many breasts. Her cult was spread over much of the known world. This temple of Artemis stood in the Decapolis city of Gerasa.
At the time of the New Testament, Ephesus was honored with the title Temple Keeper of the Great Artemis. An inscription was found in the city bearing exactly these words, as they're used by Luke in the book of Acts. All that remains of the Artemis temple in Ephesus is this column and some foundations. It was an extremely large building, over 100 meters long and almost 50 meters wide. Inside it had over 100 columns, 16 meters high. The temple was considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Behind the main altar stood a statue of Artemis, referred to in Acts 19 as the sacred stone that fell from the sky. Paul's preaching in Ephesus was very successful, so much so that the merchants who sold models of Artemis and her temple were worried that they were going to lose money. They started a riot, and a large angry crowd gathered here in the theater of Ephesus. This was one of the largest theaters in the Roman Empire. It held about 25,000 people. For about 2 hours they rioted. Paul wanted to come into the theater here and address the crowd, but because of the danger, his friends would not allow him inside. In the end, the riot ended peacefully, although it is possible that Paul spent some time in prison afterwards.
Not long afterward, Paul departed from Ephesus. While he was there, he probably wrote the letters we know as 1st and 2nd Corinthians. He may also have written other letters from Ephesus.
Probably because of its importance in the Roman administration, Ephesus soon became recognized as the mother church of a number of other churches in less important cities in the region. The book of Revelation is addressed to the churches in Ephesus and 6 of these other cities.
John, the author of the book of Revelation, may have been a leader of the church in Ephesus. He was confined to the island of Patmos, a small, barren, and sparsely populated island a few hours by boat from Ephesus. The island is only 15 kilometers long and a few kilometers wide. Patmos has many caves, and John may have lived in one of these when he received his visions. Perhaps he recorded the visions only later, after returning to Ephesus.
John was exiled probably during the reign of the Emperor Domitian, who ordered wide-scale persecutions of Christians near the end of the 1st century. The teaching of a new religion was not forbidden by the Romans. The new Christian religion taught not to worship the traditional gods. Since the Romans believed that the gods protected the state, such a teaching was considered dangerous to the stability of the empire. A Christian who refused to sacrifice to the gods or to the image of the emperor could be considered disloyal to Rome.
The third of the 7 letters in the book of Revelation was addressed to the church at Pergamum. Pergamum had long been an important city in Asia Minor, and at least for a while it had served as the capital of the province. Perhaps more significantly, it was the center of worship for 2 major cults. The first was the cult of the healing god Asklepios. Asklepios was given the title Soter, meaning savior. He was represented by a staff with snakes wrapped around it.
The ancient world had its healing cults. The most important god of healing for the ancient Greeks was the god Asklepios, with main centers in Epidaurus in the Peloponnesian Peninsula and here in Pergamum. The sick came into this treatment center, bathed themselves, and often would spend the night here or in buildings around, hoping perhaps to have a dream from the god during the night, showing them how they might be healed.
People who were healed presented to the god tokens indicating the nature of their healing. Pergamum had a medical faculty and a large library of books on the subject of sickness and ancient healing methods.
The second important cult in Pergamum was the worship of the Roman emperor. In 29 BC, the first ever temple to a Roman emperor and the goddess Roma was built in Pergamum. During the 1st century AD, the city quickly grew to become the recognized center of emperor worship in Asia.
In the letter to the Christian community of Pergamum, in the 2nd chapter of the book of Revelation, the Lord refers to Pergamum as the place where the throne of Satan is. The question now is, what is the throne of Satan? Scholars in the 19th century have thought that it may be this temple of Zeus. Other scholars have proposed to consider the state's cult worshipping Caesar and bringing sacrifices to him as the base of the meaning of the throne of Satan. A third theory thinks that the temple of the god Asklepios is meant to be the throne of Satan, because Asklepios was the god of healing, the god of salvation.
Situated in a fertile valley, the city of Laodicea was a prosperous industrial center. Here high-quality woolen clothing was produced.
Laodicea was one of the 7 churches of the book of Revelation. The Christians in Laodicea were characterized as lukewarm.
This figure of speech may hint at springs in the nearby mountains that did not produce cold water, as mountain springs normally do, but only lukewarm water. These springs still issue calcium-rich, but lukewarm water.
Paul now retraced some of his steps from his second journey, returning to churches in Macedonia and Greece, which may mean that he went as far as Corinth. He returned northward to Macedonia, and after the festival of Passover, he and his companions sailed from Philippi to the city of Troas in Asia Minor. Troas was one of the ports nearest to Greece, and Paul passed through there more than once. Hurrying to get to Jerusalem, Paul did not go into Ephesus, but only met leaders from the Ephesian church at the port of Miletus, about 70 kilometers away from Ephesus.
The final destination of the ship Paul was on was the port of Ptolemais. The ship first had to unload cargo in the city of Tyre. Paul spent a week with believers from the church there. From Ptolemais, Paul traveled to Jerusalem by foot, stopping for several days in Caesarea.
In Jerusalem, Paul was arrested and put in prison. He was sent under guard to Caesarea, where he spent about 2 years in prison. When Paul was finally tried by the Roman governor Festus, he used his right as a Roman citizen to appeal his case to the emperor in Rome.
Paul's journey to Rome did not go well, and the ship broke up off the coast of the island of Malta. He and his companions finally made it to Italy over 3 months later. Traveling north along a road called the Appian Way, Paul, still a prisoner, finally arrived in Rome. It was early in the year 60 A.D.